booked and been come take my hand. We're rebels with a paperback plan.
Welcome to Booked and Banned, the podcast, where we discuss essential literature that has faced challenges and censorship. Today on Booked and Banned, we're exploring a novel that has navigated decades of scrutiny and acclaim with remarkable staying power, Sylvia Plath's seminal work, The Bell Jar. Our guest this week is my graduate school colleague from the University of Massachusetts Amherst when we were working on our master's degrees in English literature. Amanda, welcome to the show. Please tell our listeners a little bit about who you are.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to join you after all these years. It's such a wonderful friendship and exciting collaboration. I am an associate professor of English in the Department of Humanities at New York Institute of Technology. I'm also a research affiliate at Smith College, and I do my research on Sylvia Plath. I co-edited a new edition of Sylvia Plath's collected poems, The Poems of Sylvia Plath, which will be published in May from Faber and Faber, and I co-edited it with Karen Kukiel, who has edited Plath's journals and co-edited her letters.
Well, that's fantastic. I didn't know you had a book coming out in May. So let's put the book into context. Set in the 1950s, the novel follows Esther Greenwood, a brilliant and talented college student who wins a prestigious summer internship at a fashion magazine in New York City. While she should be enjoying the glamour of the city, Esther feels a profound sense of alienation. She is disconnected from her peers, disillusioned by the superficiality of the fashion industry, and paralyzed by the narrow roles available to women. When she returns home to Massachusetts, her mental health deteriorates rapidly. What follows is a raw, unflinching account of her experience with clinical depression, which she describes as being trapped under a bell jar, breathing in the same stale air. After a series of unsuccessful treatments and a suicide attempt, Esther is hospitalized, eventually finding a path toward a tentative recovery. Despite being a pivotal text in modern literature, The Bell Jar has faced numerous challenges in schools and libraries over the decades. The primary reasons include honesty regarding mental health. Plath's graphic and unsentimental portrayal of depression and suicide was considered too dark or dangerous for younger readers by some critics. It presents a critical look at how mental illness was treated and often mistreated during the 1950s. The lobotomizing of Rosemary Kennedy at age 23 comes to mind, though that was a little earlier in 1941. It's also banned for rejection of traditional roles. The book critiques the 1950s nuclear family structure. Esther's lack of interest in marriage and motherhood was, and in some circles still is, viewed as subversive. And it's been banned for explicit content. The novel contains frank discussions of sexuality, medical procedures like electroconvulsive therapy, and profanity that led to various censorship attempts. The Bell Jar remains a formidable piece of literature because it refuses to sugarcoat the reality of the human mind. It isn't just a story about illness, it's a story about the search for a self that the world hasn't yet defined. So, Amanda, as a scholar of Sylvia Plath, you've spent a great deal of time with her poetry. Since The Bell Jar is her only published novel, why do you feel this prose work is such a vital piece of her legacy? What does this narrative allow her to express that perhaps her poetry does not capture?
Thank you so much. One of my professors in graduate school would say, "Tell me the book that started it all." And for me, that book was The Bell Jar. I was reading Plath at the time in a poetry course, and a friend suggested I read The Bell Jar. I didn't know anything about it. Now people do know a bit more from social media and popularization of Plath in popular culture, but I didn't know anything about it. And especially because poetry is intimidating, I have found that this book and the perspective of the protagonist in it draws a lot of people in. They want to understand the voice that is so determined, that sees the world a bit differently, that wants to succeed, that is ambitious, but is also thwarted in different ways and critical in different ways. I had not seen a character like this who was more critical of college life as a college student. People compare her, Esther Greenwood, Plath's autobiographical protagonist, they compare her to Holden Caulfield, but this was a bit different. She was concerned about whether she was on the right path, whether she had done the right things, and she wasn't having as much fun as everyone else. It always seemed like everyone was having a lot more fun and not critical of their experience. But Esther is certainly critical of her experience, and she's most concerned, I think, about whether she can succeed, whether she has been prepared to succeed. There's a lot of things she encounters that lead her to doubt herself when she has been such a successful person. So it's this idea, this student that she is, that I think fuels much of Plath's life, that she identifies very much as this student, and that shapes her identity as a poet, that I think draws a lot of people in and brings them to the poetry. And then they see her poetry has autobiographical elements, and some of them overlap with the bell jar, but is different. But poetry can be hard to understand. So those pieces inspire people, and they see these connections, and then they keep reading and understand poetry as poetry. And they read her biography and her journals and her letters and see the ways that she depicts different moments in different ways and the same moments in different ways. There's a lot about the history of her writing of this novel that people know. They don't seem to know as much about other writers and their creative process, but Plath has been so popular that people know a lot about it. She wrote this novel in England in 1961, but she wrote it on this pink paper she stole. And she was teaching at Smith in 1958, and she had her breakdown in 1953. And she had been wanting to write a novel for some time, but frustrated. She thought originally she was going to write about her Cambridge experience. And so she stole all this pink paper. And then she came to write The Bell Jar a little bit later. She used the pink paper for a lot of things, and Hughes used it too. And then when she did write the novel, The Bell Jar, she had read other books like it, like The Snake Pit by Mary Jane Ward, and she wanted to make use of her experience. And she does so in her own way, and she had read so many things that it's an artistic feat, and a lot of the imagery in it comes to shape her poems, and some poems she wrote before shape the novel. So it's sort of a step in her literary development, a sort of gateway to her poems, I think. Like Robert Lowell's 91 Revere Street was a gateway in life studies to him writing more autobiographically. I think some of the arc of the novel freed her up to bring new life to some of the moments in her later poems.
I love that idea of the novel being a gateway
Yeah.
into her poetry. I think that's fantastic. You know, the metaphor of the bell jar is such a distinct image of isolation, breathing in the same stale air while the world moves on around you. And yet, Plath's narrative is interwoven with acerbic wit, which admittedly I didn't remember from reading the novel as a teenager, but it was definitely there when I was rereading it many, many years later as an adult. How do you think Plath's description of clinical depression resonates with readers today? Does it still feel as relevant now as it did in 1963? And how does it contrast with the elements of humor in the novel?
I think The Bell Jar was incredibly capacious as a choice, something that we keep understanding. Colin Hoeg, who's an anthropology professor at Smith, wrote this article recently in Environmental Humanities about how at Smith they studied botany with bell jars, and the bell jars are still there that Plath used, wherever they're going to go. And he curated an exhibition with his students about the metaphor of the bell jar in terms of Plath's fiction and prose, but also historically how they studied plants. And so Plath knew all of this, and there's certain plants in her work that she studied, and he wrote about this. But he sees the metaphor as one that she knew allowed plants to thrive. But in her case, and in Esther's case, she was somewhat thwarted and not given the conditions to thrive. That's some of the opposition that she faces. Despite all of her own preparation and her own efforts, there are obstacles in her way. There's this video with Aurelia Plath where she calls it a distorting lens. And there are clear moments of distortion in the novel. But I often ask students whether it's a distorting lens or a clarifying lens or both. And I think it's both, because There's so much critique of her society that is part of how she differentiates Esther from her contemporaries, that she is more concerned about the Rosenbergs than they are. And it's not just something she brings to the book. It was also something she noted at the time when she was in New York. There's a journal passage that she took notes that night when she was reflecting on the Rosenberg execution. The Rosenberg execution at the time was a big human rights issue, though people weren't paying enough attention to it, she felt. And she wrote in her journal, "The phones are ringing as usual, and the people planning to leave for the country over the weekend, and everybody is lackadaisical and rather glad, and nobody very much thinks about how big a human life is, with all the nerves and sinews and reactions and responses that it took centuries and centuries to evolve." So that element of clarity or critique is something that she brings to the novel, that she brings this gaze to the behavior of others. I was going to talk more about some of how she does that with mental illness maybe a bit later, but her humor is there in that critique, I think, and her sort of biting wit. Doreen helps fuel this, the bringing in of these characters. She likes doubling. She likes pairing people together. So early in the novel, you get Betsy and Doreen, and later on, you get Joan. But there are these sort of foils she sets up. But Doreen sort of was her introduction to being subversive, not following the rules. It sort of shows her as one who follows the rules, but then even so, is like poisoned and experiences all these elements that come in her way. But that element of kind of making fun of people a bit and making fun of the world around her is something that's there as she's critical.
I had a different vision of the bell jar. I think that my experience of it is usually when I'm having a conversation with another person, and maybe we're in a really busy cafe and there's all this noise around us. And the bell jar just comes down over the two of us, and it's just the two of us having that conversation. But I also realize that differs from Plath's concept, where the bell jar is isolating a single person. And my idea of it was that it was isolating me with someone else while we were having this, really profound conversation or this deep moment. But I also never felt trapped in it either. And I think that that comes through in the book. And I think that that's what Plath meant it to come through, is that it can trap you. One of the most famous passages in the book is the fig tree metaphor, where Esther is paralyzed by the many different lives she could lead. Do you see this as a struggle unique to women in the 1950s, the feminine mystique notwithstanding? Or is that anxiety over, quote unquote, having it all a universal experience for young people?
I think it's far more intense now. I think there's a lot more pressure now to come to college with more of a plan of a practical return on your investment, because it's such a huge investment. It was a huge investment then too, but I feel like there's more weight. There's also the element that as much as you have to have a plan, you can change and you can become inspired. But students often fear and question whether they made the right decision. I think that's something Plath grapples with throughout the novel, especially early on. And then a bit later, the buddy character kind of draws out how committed she is to her own path and how critical he is of what she had decided or what she cared about. She does not want to be the rag rug under people's feet that his mother was making. But there's different ways that she sort of tests out these different identities in the novel and looks to different examples, but still isn't able to resolve this dilemma. It's used a lot in popular culture and pops up in very unexpected places. But I think it's relevant now because people fear not being able to change course, but they can get inspired and people can get more degrees, and there's always these new pathways people are creating.
Yeah, I saw that a lot when I was teaching at West Point with my cadets, where they thought they had to have one specific major, and it wasn't necessarily something that they enjoyed. And I'm like, you're guaranteed employment after college, because all of them were going into the Army, barring some sort of medical reason. So I was like, pick the thing you love. If you like philosophy, study philosophy, because it doesn't matter for your career. And it really didn't, at least not as Army officers and then whatever they went on to afterward. And of course, now I have my own college student who frequently catastrophizes. So I do think that there's a lot more pressure on college age students these days to have a plan. My daughter will catastrophize over getting a job and that she has the right major and she has the right minor and she has to get this class so that she can get the next class. And I'm kind of like, you're already on the 5-year plan, relax, you know? And she's just not seeing it that way. She feels like she has to get through everything as quickly as possible. And I'm more in the camp of, but what about the possibilities? You know, when you do that, what possibilities are you closing off by sticking to some arbitrary plan that may not fit you anymore? So I do think that that's really relevant for college students and even high school students these days. And a lot of it is the pressure they put on themselves, but some of it's pressure from society, some of it's from their parents or what have you. So I wish that that was different from them. And maybe if they read the bell jar, it might be. Since this is booked and banned, we have to talk about censorship, of course. This novel has been challenged for its quote, darkness, unquote, and its rejection of traditional family roles. It depicts the struggle to remain authentic while being squeezed into the perfect woman mold of the mid-century era. In your view, which aspect of Esther's journey do you think creates the most discomfort for those who seek to restrict this book in schools or libraries?
I think it's definitely mental health and suicide. There's a fear of copycats and there's a fear of people becoming too influenced. There early in the novel, there's also an assault. People are only lately noticing that. And that's one of the problems of this book. People didn't notice this assault for like 30 years. It's not funny, but people are writing about it now in this collection I'm working on. Someone submitted an abstract for consideration of trauma just recently on this, and there aren't many articles on this, but that's not something censors noticed. They probably noticed there's a lesbian character who does commit suicide. That was the subject of a lawsuit regarding the film because the real character sued Ted Hughes. She was a real person and she did not commit suicide, but Plath wrote that into the novel, perhaps for an arc that allowed a distance from Esther's character as she is repaired by the end. There's also a very strange funeral that I had forgotten entirely at the end of the novel. And because you read a novel so many times, but I had never noticed how strange the funeral scene is for Joan. And some of the moments in the novel are very deadpan too. There's sort of like it's not a humor, but it's sort of like an emotionlessness to it. But I think the mental health parts are also an important form of activism. Other writers, there's a good article about this by Elizabeth Donaldson in the Bloomsbury Handbook to Sylvia Plath, and about Mary Jane Ward and how the snake pit, which influenced Plath, was also a work of advocacy for mental health treatment and improving it, as was The Ha Ha, which is a novel by Jennifer Dawson that Plath read later. And so while Plath did not become an activist in the ways that they did, some of her depictions of, say, electric shock treatment and it being akin to electrocution because it was handled poorly at first, and then that parallels the Rosenbergs, that's horrible, and then that would scare people. And then her later depiction of the more healing feminist woman doctor who performs it correctly, that's also documenting its potential, but in ways that the practice has gone in and out of favor in different ways. But I mean, this sort of documentary element of both sides of this have different effects on documenting the treatment of mental illness at the time and psychiatric treatment. There's the doctor who dismisses her. There's the insulin treatment. There's all these elements that are, historically relevant, but also help to shape and hopefully improve future treatment. There are elements that teachers or school boards might want to protect students from, but there are also many elements that are empowering in different ways throughout the book.
Well, and I think that anything can be a teachable moment, and that we shouldn't just wall ourselves off from discomfort, and we shouldn't wall off our kids from discomfort too. One of the reasons why I'm doing this podcast is that banned books have great things to teach us, whether we are comfortable with those things or not. Readers often treat The Bell Jar as a literal autobiography, assuming Esther Greenwood is simply a pseudonym for Plath herself. And she also used a nom de plume for its first publication. This reflects a broader tendency to view confessional poetry, the movement Plath is famously linked to, as a series of raw diary entries rather than carefully constructed art. As a scholar, how do you help readers distinguish between Plath's life and her literary craft? Why is it important to respect this book as a work of fiction rather than a clinical case study?
I'm so glad you asked this because I wrote a book about Plath's reading and I became incredibly interested in her reading, not necessarily for the way that it always made its way into her work, but the way that it too shows her engagement with the intellectual life of her time, which was so expansive. So as a reader and as a writer, Plath was seeking to make art, not just describe life. She does in her journals and her letters describe accounts, but even they have a certain art to them in that a letter or a diary entry are not lived life. And they are accounts for an audience, even if the audience is one that's yourself, but you imagine someone reading it. I think in her journals, she was pushing herself as a writer as well, sort of practicing. But one of the things she did in her books too was note things that echoed her life or how she might depict it. So one passage in her copy of Axel's Castle, which is this book about the 90s and writers and symbolism, and you would not expect it to be thrilling, but Plath absolutely loved this book. She read it after her breakdown, which I think gave her like new license to be excited about being a student again. And she drew so many exclamation points in it. And there's one part where she says, like, thank God next to Milton's reputation has sunk. She had lots of fun, but she also marked this passage that's a lot like the one I was reading about the Rosenbergs. And it's about T.S. Eliot's poem, The Wasteland. And Wilson explains, all about us, we are aware of nameless millions performing barren office routines, wearing down their souls in interminable labors of which the products never bring them profit, people whose pleasures are so sordid and so feeble that they seem almost sadder than their pains. And she wrote 1953, yes, exclamation point, June, NYC. So, I mean, she was seeing these moments and building toward bringing them to her work. But she also gives her work an arc. And that arc includes things like Joan, who was really Jane Anderson, but did not commit suicide. Creates certain elements, plot points, and descriptions that fit the world she's describing, bringing in repeated images, describing things in ways that they will echo throughout the novel. And she knew from her reading that work is not just, a transcript of life, but she was also empowered a lot by figures like Robert Lowell and Anne Sexton and the work they were doing. She didn't come to be as direct as they were because they came to see confession and they came to see themselves be identified with it, where she more knew it was cutting edge and she was doing it. But she didn't tell people. She would write about her poems. This is about a girl with an electric complex. She wouldn't be like, this is me and my dad. So there's a distance there. She's always creating. And when she creates Esther, she creates a whole world for her. And she brings different rhythms to her life and distortions or clarifications that she may not have experienced herself. But when things do match up, it is really interesting, partly because there's this taboo about reading life into art. But it also draws into relief like the differences.
So at the end of the novel, Esther describes herself as, quote, patched, retreaded, and approved for the road. Sounds like a tire, Yet she acknowledges the bell jar could descend again any time. How did you interpret that conclusion? Did you find it to be a hopeful moment or a more cautious warning?
I went down a rabbit hole learning about tire retreading this week because I got so fascinated by the technology of it and how this may mirror in some ways the mass production of psychiatric treatment and institutionalization. The way that we patch people up, or at her moment, the way they were patching people up with electric shocks, and the way that tire retreading changed with technology and synthetics. But I also was interested in this metaphor because a retreaded tire is less durable. So the tire throughout the book takes on different roles. There's the same article I was talking about by Elizabeth Donaldson has a part about the scene where near the end of the novel, Buddy comes and he's all upset. Was it me? Was it my fault that two of my former girlfriends attempted and committed suicide? It was partly Buddy's fault, probably, but it's not his fault. Buddy is someone who sees himself physically ill with tuberculosis as having almost a more legitimate disease than Esther, who is suffering from mental illness. And he can't shovel himself out of the snow because his tire is stuck, but Esther does it for him. And that's something a man would do. So he's emasculated and he says to her, like, who will marry you, Esther? So she's damaged goods to him, even though he had to even borrow a shovel. And there's this part in the article where Elizabeth says something like, he didn't even have the right tool. So the ending, I think, is complicated because that tire returns. And I think that a retreaded tire is a version of that doormat as well. Buddy's mom was making this rag rug from repurposed discards that people are just going to walk over. So she doesn't want to be that rag rug. But here she is patched up. And what I hope is that in this patching, some of her cynical early gaze still is there. Because she's not a new tire. She still might have some of that insight into her world. I hope. She is prepared in some ways, but she is, I think, realistically cautious that this could happen again.
Yeah, I think Buddy is kind of insufferable. There's an old feminist saying, I think it's from the second wave, about how women were becoming the men they used to want to marry. Now there's a whole transgender twist on that, or there could be, but women are reaching full self-realization and they don't necessarily need to get married to do that. And I think that's what was happening with Esther, which is really something amazing to think about. And I think that also makes the ending a little bit hopeful, even if, and I find this, that you went down this tire metaphor rabbit hole. So
no idea about vulcanizing. I mean, this was fascinating. Not to mention the whole history of India rubber.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a long history, but it was retreading reached its peak in the 50s and 60s. And then later became used more for commercial vehicles.
I had no idea.
But it was the Depression that brought out the need for sustainable goods. So this was really interesting to me because Plath was very attentive to advertisements and products. There's a really good piece by Marsha Bryant about that really drew to my attention how many times she mentions brand names or slogans. How did she know about retreading? I mean, she did have a flat tire once. It's in the journals. It was later. It was in 1958. But the idea that she was thinking about this, and Mrs. Guinea in the book, the patron, she has her own car. And early in the book, she says, people must be thinking I'm steering New York like my own private car. So it's almost as if she doesn't quite want to be Miss Guinea, who wrote these somewhat superficial books. But that's sort of like a version of I Am the Arrow in Ariel. She wants to be the driver of her own car. She wants to write the poems. She wants to dictate her own thrilling letters. She doesn't just want to be the tire that helps the car move or it's retreaded and ready to go. And his insult to her hinges on the fact that he will survive and he will become strong again and finish medical school or whatever and be successful, but she's damaged forever. I think it's false and ignorant, but he had his own issues.
Yeah, he did.
But
It's just
yeah.
purity culture, it's purity culture.
It wasn't his fault.
Yeah.
He was part of a larger system.
Yeah, he definitely was. Well, as we wrap up, what are your final thoughts on the legacy of this novel? What is the one thing you truly want our listeners to take away from The Bell Jar?
I think that Esther and Plath's dedication comes through the fact that she takes her art so seriously and that her intellectual life is on the line. There was a quotation I was writing down that was in the passage just before Plath attempted suicide, but it was something to the effect of losing her intellectual life was what she was most afraid of, losing intellectual and academic success. That was so important to her. And I think that that stays with people's associations with Plath. Plath was also often trivialized, but I think this book sort of brings that to the forefront, that early in the book, you don't necessarily know what she's experiencing. You just know that she's been incredibly successful and that she loves poetry so much. Like, poetry was so intimidating, I think, as a student, that the fact that many people find their way into reading so much more from Plath is incredibly important. And I think the bell jar is part of that.
I think you are right. Thank you, Amanda, so much for coming on the podcast. Our next episode will be a discussion of Red Rising by Pierce Brown, which is a, I guess, fantasy/science fiction novel. Thank you all for joining us today. As Isaac Asimov said, any book worth banning is a book worth reading.
Booked and banned and bound by pages, stories hiding through the ages, whispered truths that still ring clear for those who choose to listen here. Booked and banned, we take a stand, turning words into common ground. Booked and banned, come take my hand, we're rebels with a paperback